Howdy, folks, and welcome to TuneScores, your source for fake news and music reviews. My name's Cary Nightingale. With me, as always, is Kevin Niebrick. Kevin, how you doing tonight?
About 96%.
Man, these small improvements are just wonderful to hear about. I hope you're excited, because this episode, we're going to talk about three masterpieces from my favorite year in jazz, 1959. My hypothesis is that most of the most memorable jazz tunes came from 1959. And so I tried to corroborate that on Wikipedia, and they have an article called 1959 in Jazz. But the most notable song that I saw on there is actually 1960 when it was released. It was recorded in 59, so I felt a little bit bamboozled. It was like playing YouTube roulette, but it was on Wikipedia and involved a fact. Those things happen. But instead, I did pick three songs from the jazz genre that were released in 1959 that you and most of the audience have probably heard at some point in your life. And if not, go out and check them out. Kevin, you checked them out, and since these are my picks, you're going to go ahead and prosecute, and I will defend each one and hopefully be able to convey why they're important, not just for jazz, but for music in general, and why I think they're worthwhile. So the first one that we're going to touch on is So What by Miles Davis. The second one is Take 5 by Dave Brubeck. And then the final one is Goodbye Pork Pie Hat by Charles Mingus. So let's go ahead and kick it off. Kev, if you would be so kind as to tell us about what you found in the composition of So What by Miles Davis.
Right on. Solid construction here. Miles got a 3.3 out of 4 for me for composition. Everything was great. I think that really the rhythm here stands out for me in particular. Everybody's doing their own thing, and they all have interesting rhythms going on throughout. But Cary, would you do me a favor? Will you explain modal jazz for dummies like me who aren't quite sure what that is?
Okay, I would be happy to, as well as I can. So jazz is beyond description, but modal means that rather than having a typical chord progression and following the changes in chords for your melody, it's a little bit more free form. And mode, you've probably heard of a scale, right, Kev?
Oh, sure.
Okay, so like a C major scale is the notes C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P, right?
Yeah, that's what I remember too.
Okay, it's the white keys on a piano, starting at C. So that's C major, and C feels like home. Each of those white keys, though, and you could do this with the black keys as well, but just using that one scale, that set of 7 notes, 8 if you count the second C, depending on which one you start on or which one you make feel like home, it's going to have a different feel to it. So if you start with C and just use the white keys, that's C major. But if you start on the next white key, D, that's got a little bit more of a sad or mysterious feel to it. Not quite minor, which is what would happen if you started on A, but if you start on D, that's called the Dorian mode. It's a little bit sadder because it has the minor third key in it, or note in it, and it's also got the major sixth. So it's not quite as sad as the minor that would start on A, and it would have the minor third, but also have the minor sixth note in it. So modal jazz takes a mode. In this case, it takes D Dorian, which is the same as C major, but D is the home, and improvises on top of that. There are also some shifts from D Dorian to E flat Dorian. So it's just a half step modulation up and then back. Now, Wikipedia describes this as a 32-bar AABA structure with those A sections in Dorian and the B section in E flat Dorian. but I can only really hear a stark contrast much later in the song. And if they only played 16 bars in the first 7 minutes, I'll eat my pork pie hat. Does that description of modal jazz or modality make sense to you?
Gets me closer to an understanding. Yeah, thank you.
So that adventure in modal jazz and its description notwithstanding, as far as the composition goes for this song, I feel like the harmony is better described as texture and accents than just the chord progression. Combined with the steady rhythm, it provides a fine canvas for all of that improvisation that happens throughout. You've got the trumpet, you've got 2 different saxophones. The composition score for me on this one, because of that bass line and then the trumpet riff that happens at the end of the bass line, that's the most recognizable part. This was a 2.7 out of an available 4 points. And I'll just describe typical melodic context. There's not a typical melody to this one in the same way that we'll hear in the next couple of songs. That rated at 0.7 out of 1 point. There are no lyrics, so there's nothing there to wow us and nothing there to offend us. That's half credit out of a point. The rhythm was the strongest element I felt at 0.8 out of 1, and the harmony at 0.7 out of 1, because there is still texture, there still are chords, there's still something that gets built on. Performance here I thought was really strong, rated at 1 out of 1.2 points. Each of the 4 soloists had their own feel or flavor to their time in the limelight, starting with Miles Davis on the trumpet, then going to Coltrane, then Cannonball Adderley. So those are the 2 different saxophones. And then on to Bill Evans on piano. In a way, it kind of detracts from cohesion, but in another way, it adds greater breadth to the experience. Based on typical jazz production of the time, I thought this was very much in line with what to expect, rated at 2/3 credit. Kev, what did you think about the performance and the production, and how did the song appeal to you?
Yeah, we weren't far off. In fact, miles out of me for performance production. I may have given a few extra points here. For the performance of the piece was 1.1 out of 1.2 for me. Definitely nailed the feel for sure. Production, a little bit lower, 0.9 out of 1.2. And my gripe is always with most of these songs that we listen to tonight, and just typically across the board, I'm always straining to hear that bass, and it just bothers me. And I'm sure it's no easy task, I'm sure, to make that bass nice and audible in the mix. But that's where I sit with that. The appeal for me, very strong. Ended up with a 2.9 for appeal overall. Emotion, I gave them both. I gave 1.2 out of 1.6 for this. Usually I reserve that for songs that just missed me in emotion. I would say that this one, without knowing where it's going, it definitely had a feel to it for sure. Thought 1.2 would be a fair score for both this one and Brubeck. But repeat listenability is nice tonight, 1.6. So this is a great tune. Very much happy that you got me to listen to this. I actually ordered the vinyl for this. So that should be coming in a few days.
Wow. Well, with a full credit repeat listenability score, it would make sense that you'd want to get it on vinyl as well.
Mm-hmm.
So this song came from Kind of Blue, the album by Miles Davis. And there's a reason why that album is one of the most celebrated in all of jazz. For me personally, I need to find myself in the right context to listen to a 9.5-minute song or an album like this. But when the opportunity arises, it's on. For me, it rated at 3/4 credit for emotion and repeat listenability for a segment total there of 2.6 out of 3.6. And my overall tune score was a 7.1 out of 10. Kev, what was your final tune score on it?
Ended up with an 8.2.
Okay. So there you have it. We're off to a strong start for our 1959 in jazz exploration. But that said, it's time for a short break. This one's brought to you by the Lazy Leopard Acne Treatment. You might have been born with spots, just like the leopard, but now at least you can do something about it. We'll be right back.
That's cute.
Howdy, folks, and welcome back. For our next song, as we discover 1959 in jazz, we've got Dave Brubeck with Take 5. Again, my selection. So, Kev, if you would be so kind as to tell us what you thought about the composition.
Of course. Really strong composition again on this one. In fact, all three songs we listened to today had a very strong composition. They all ended up with the same score, in fact. 3.3 overall. But in this one specifically, I think the strength lies in the melody, that saxophone melody in the beginning. It's very memorable. It's amazing. It really pulls the whole piece together. Generally, this composition is very simple. It's unique, and it's very versatile. It's very enjoyable. How do you feel about the composition?
So that interesting rhythmic figure that you hear dominating this song is a 5/4 time signature. Now, 5/4 could be jarring to a lot of Western ears, but it's played with such a swing here, a swing feel here, that it's actually easy not to notice. That melody that you mentioned, you're absolutely right. I think that's the standout, most memorable part of the song, although I did give full credit to the rhythm for being in a mysterious 5/4.
You love those, yeah. You love those time signatures, yeah.
I do. And the mnemonic that I would use to remember the beat is taco with beef and cheese, taco with beef and cheese. So that melody was written by saxophonist Paul Desmond, and it's just sublime. And it might be interesting to note, as far as structure of a lot of jazz songs from this era and probably still today, because jazz is much more than just 1959. The structure often would begin and end the song on basically the same section. They would call it the head, that main melody. And then everything that happened in the middle was mostly improvisational. So this one rated an overall 3.0 out of 4 for the composition. Now, the performance I thought was even just a little bit stronger than what we found in So What. I rated it a 1.1 out of 1.2. Now, maybe it's the breathiness of that saxophone or the rigorous challenge of playing in an odd meter when your heart really just wants to go back to beating in 4/4 time. But this has some of the best feel of any track we've listened to, particularly with all those dynamics of Brubeck's piano playing during the drum solo. I think that adds so much to it. And I thought the production was adequate. Production was probably not as prevalent or important, the mix and the arrangement, getting the volume right, letting the players do what they do. So this rated at a 2/3 credit for me on the production. But Kev, how did you feel about the performance, production, and how did it appeal to you?
About the same as you did here. We got a 1.1 for performance. My point structure is a little bit different. My rating is a little bit different than yours. The first time they attempted to record this song, they took 20 unsuccessful attempts. They were having an off day. And they returned the next day and they got this recording. It's a very decent recording. Everything is solid. They nailed it. They were like, that's it. We're done. Press it. But this is not my favorite recording of this song by far. Leaves a little something to be desired from me. But again, solid. They did an excellent job. The production, 0.9 out of 1.2. The one gripe I had was with the arrangement. There's no piano solo. It's Dave Brubeck. It says Quartet. There's no piano solo on this one. That kind of bothers me. But as far as appeal goes, 2.7. Emotion, again, I gave it that 1.2. I feel like it's a fair rating there. Innovation, I gave it 0.3 out of 0.4, just for being outside of a normal time signature. Very interesting. Repeat listenability is definitely high, 1.2 out of 1.6. How does it land for appeal with you?
A little bit higher. This track appeals to me a little bit more than So What did, at a 3.0 out of 3.6. Most of it's just repeat listenability, a 1.5 out of 1.6. This is considered cool jazz or West Coast jazz. It's a bit experimental, this track especially, with that odd meter, but it just sounds cool. It's relaxed. Makes me feel like I'm getting ready for a caper. It's slightly too relaxed to garner full emotional credit, but I do think it remains eminently listenable. It's rated a 3.0 out of 3.6 for the appeal for me, with an overall tune score of 7.9 out of 10. I actually prefer a live video recording of this song where not only does Dave Brubeck not take a piano solo, he just stops playing the piano entirely and turns around so he can watch Joe Morello play the drums so fantastically. That's my favorite version of it. Kev, what was your final score?
Dave got an 8.0 for this one for me.
We're getting close. With that said, I think it's time to take 5 ourselves, and we'll be right back. Howdy, folks, and welcome back to the program. Now that Kevin and I had a chance to take 5 ourselves, we actually discovered that the recording of Take 5 that Kevin was talking about preferring and the one that I was talking about preferring are actually the same one. So that's an interesting little bombshell. The official version of Take 5 by Dave Brubeck is not necessarily the best version, since Kevin and I both prefer that live TV recorded version that we were talking about.
And you noticed a couple things there. So the first thing that you mentioned was that he just kind of turns around and watches the drummer go, which is beautiful, and it's an amazing thing to watch. That drum solo is great. But the thing you pointed out there was he's not vamping on the piano at that time. He's not doing the melody for the song or the vamping that he does throughout the song on the piano. He's not doing it for that portion for the drum solo. So it's kind of giving the drummer free rein to just kind of go off and do his own thing, which I think is what makes that drum solo so much stronger in that recording than it does on the recording we listen to, the one people are most familiar with, I imagine.
Right. And I think a big part of it is getting to see 4 guys on stage, accountants probably, is sort of how they appear, appreciating their craft and the craftsmanship of each other without showmanship necessarily. So that moment where Dave turns around from the piano and watches Joe Morello play the drums and actually breathe that solo, that's one of the great moments that you miss when you're just listening to a song. So fantastic stuff. But speaking of fantastic stuff, we've got one last gem from 1959 in jazz for you. It's Goodbye, Pork Pie Hat by Charles Mingus. Kev, tell us what you thought of the composition on this one.
Will do. So 3.3 for composition, as all the songs tonight for me. But again, in this one, something else stood out to me as the most important part of it. And I think the harmony really stood out to me as top tier. Very excellent. So 1.0 out of 1.0 for that. But how's the composition strike you for Mingus there?
Goodbye, Pork Pie Hat introduces itself with one of the sadder melodies you could ever hope to meet. So it's the melody really that stands out to me. Everything is excellent, but that's the standout for me. The subsequent solos after that opening melody extend the melancholy, but they kind of wrap it with hope, with despair, and with fond memories. The rhythm and the harmony are both steady and appropriate to the piece. The lyrics, like all of the songs that we listen to, are just terrible because they're not there. I rated it a 3.0 out of 4 for its composition. The performance, I thought, was on par with even the Take 5 televised recording that we were discussing at 1.1 out of 1.2. Pork Pie Hat was the nickname of Lester Young, a former band member who'd passed away mere months prior to the recording of this particular track. Mingus wrote it for his departed friend, but it's plain to hear that the entire group mourns him. Tremendous feel I felt for this performance. The production rated actually just a slight tick higher for me than the other two tracks we've listened to at 0.9 out of 1.2. Normally, I would rail against all the static crackling that appears at about 2 minutes 44 into the song and kind of stays with us till the end. But there's something about it that in this context is actually endearing. So that was my take on performance and production. Tell us how you found it, Kev.
This is actually, so for performance especially, I thought this was the best of the three tonight. So it ended up with a 1.2, full marks across the board. You're absolutely right. They nailed the feel of the piece. I thought the accuracy was there as well. I have no notes. It was perfect. Production, very similar, very close. 1.1 out of 1.2. Thought the arrangement was nice. Everything was in its place. The one gripe I had, again, I'm straining to hear that bass. That's where it ends up with that. The appeal, highest so far for tonight. I think 3.1 overall. The emotion, 100%. Nailed it. Innovation wasn't really high, but repeat listenability was 1.4 out of 1.6. I got much more emotion from this piece in particular than the other two. So it ended up with a final score of 8.7 overall.
Wow. And for appeal, I rated it probably just about as high at 3.3 out of 3.6 with full credit on both emotion and repeat listenability. If you've ever wondered whether a eulogy has to be delivered with words, this track will tell you definitively that the answer is no. And if you need any further proof within the song, listen at 1:47 to that rapid articulation on both saxophones and the bass. The bass, Kev, is in the right channel on this. So you do have to strain a little bit. I think that's common of most recordings of this time period. The bass just isn't that prominent, which is funny because Charles Mingus's primary instrument was upright bass. This is hardly an uplifting song, but I think it's well worth repeat listens, even if you're not that into jazz. And I would say the same for, the rest of the songs that we've discussed tonight. My final score on this one was an 8.3 out of 10. So I think in order to wrap it up on a high note, all three of the tracks that we listened to are very listenable. They're great examples of jazz from that time period. So What is more an example of modal jazz. Take 5 of cool jazz, and Goodbye Pork Pie Hat is maybe a little bit more traditional, but highly emotive. So if you're looking to get into jazz, this would be an excellent place to start. I could sit here and read the Wikipedia article, 1959 in jazz to you. I've got spare time, but I would rather you as the audience pick out what you like, what appeals to you first, and start exploring from there. In the same way that Kev might start doing with his newest addition to his vinyl collection, and that I'm trying to do as I continue to study jazz and other forms of music. That's part of the reason why we're here. But with that said, I think it's time to end. We had a lot of fun with this particular episode. We want to thank you so much for tuning in. We invite you to check out these songs and others from the jazz genre. As always, that's been Kevin Niebrick. I've been Cary Nightingale. Thanks so much and take care. We'll see you in the next one.